ongoing investigations, but let's shift focus to the latest developments that have occurred in Africa. Africa Week Review, where we take a look at what stood out in the course of the week in the continent. Joining me in studio, Regional Affairs Analyst Onchari Oyieyo. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, now let's begin with the first ever Russia-Africa Summit. President Vladimir Putin officially opened the two-day event where all 54 African states are represented, including 43 heads of state. Now, I said it earlier, it seems like a news scramble for Africa, bearing in mind, the Russian companies seem to be competing with the European counterparts, the US counterparts, also bearing in mind what is happening with the East and Africa as well. Latest $20 billion in terms of debt relief have been released by Russia, going into Africa's efforts to continue development-wise. This is good news for the continent, but what does it speak keenly about the continent's reliance on foreign borrowing and the account as well?
Thank you so much. I think the 20 billion debt relief for African countries is just a mere token. And it's supposed to be actually an indication of what we're doing as Africans as far as development is concerned. We're moving backwards instead of forwards. So we keep on borrowing, and we don't have a way of doing what? Servicing all the money, all the debts. And of course, for us, it's too little, too late. It cannot compete with the rest of the superpowers, if I dare say, in the outreach towards the continent. You remember the Americans had a summit with African countries, the Chinese had one, the Indians had one, yes, just like you mentioned earlier, Germany had one, and Japan as well. So they're doing it so late. And I think it's meant to just portray Russia as also being part of the big, boys club. But I don't think it's going to compete in any reasonable way. And Russia has always been, I think, unfriendly towards Africans and African countries. And one of the hardest places for an African to actually live is Russia itself. So they're not going to be as well positioned as the Americans or the Britons or the Chinese in competing for space in Africa. I know they're making moves. They're giving military aid to Cameroon, Central African Republic, but that is going. Well. Yeah, it's not going to be enough.
Okay.
Yeah, the U.S., the Britons, and the Chinese are well positioned to keep their grip on Africa.
But speaking from the African point of view, in terms of new funding options, it seems like we're trying to catch a little bit from every simple corner that tries to offer something. How would you talk as an African right now?
Well, I think it's a boost to the bad manners African heads of state and government have in terms of borrowing. In fact, what we need from the rest of the world for our leaders to be disciplined is to cut down every kind of borrowing that we're doing, because it's a burden. As we speak now, Kenya has a 63% debt to GDP ratio, which is unacceptable. The recommended ratio is 50%. That is debt to GDP. So we've gone to 63%. Yes. We are on the red as we speak now. And that is the same for so many African countries. So any country which extends additional borrowing opportunities to African countries is just, promoting what? Bad manners.
Or
and that is how,
policy.
Yes, that is how you crash African economies. And it's a trap. So the resources we have in places like DRC and CIR and all those places will actually be now siphoned too by countries like Russia, China, and the US. And Africa will continue being poor for the next, 10 to 15, decades.
Well, something that looks like a positive. We all know nearly 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity. But with growing populations and rising demand for power, we sort of understand this. Now, Moscow is sure to tout nuclear energy at the Russia-Africa Summit. It stood out for me, selling it as a solution for the continent's perennial problem in terms of power supply. So just how concerned should we be about its intentions and Africa's readiness dealing with nuclear, power, nuclear energy?
Now, I want us to be very, very careful when we talk about nuclear energy, because it's not something you just, move in and begin exploiting. When you look at even superpowers like the US, they have a problem of, taking care of waste from the nuclear plant. It's not something Africa is ready to take advantage of. And even developed countries have a problem dealing with nuclear energy. But the Russians have to dangle it as a carrot to excite our heads of state and government who don't even have a plan to take advantage of that. So for me, that is a very small thing, and very few African countries are ready to actually take advantage of that. Maybe it's Nigeria and South Africa. Even Kenya is not ready. We don't even have a segment in our learning institutions, including the University of Nairobi, where nuclear scientists can be done what? Groomed to take care of this. So that is not going to be useful for anybody. Yeah, so we don't have to, I don't think we need to blow it out of proportion, because at the end of the day, it does not add up to anything at all. And you realize the kind of trade Russia has been having with Africa is very small compared to the rest of the world, the big boys club. China, as of I think 2018, traded with Africa up to around $204 billion. In contrast, Russia had 20 billion. That is, I think, 10% of the trade that China did with Africa. So you can see where Russia is. It's way behind. So they're going to take a long time to catch up. And for the Africans, again, like I said earlier, it shouldn't be a reason for excitement. In fact, we need to just draw back in and focus on what we need to do as Africans. And I think now the best president for Africa in the US is Trump, because he's ignored us. For us to move forward and be able to get our own homegrown solutions, we have to be ignored. They have to cut funding. They have to allow us not to borrow anything from their places. Like now, they decided to actually come up with a plan to stop corrupt guys from traveling to the US.
Even their spouses and children as well.
That's the kind of move we need to make sure we can rethink our position as Africans and how we can take care of our problems. There's no way you can keep on borrowing and stealing. It doesn't work like that.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Now, we have if I can go ahead and make a few statements here.
No problem, yes.
We have an economy that has actually crashed. As me and you are seated here, Kenya is in the red. We have a cabinet where a cabinet minister can appoint a dead man to a board. Okay, we have that. And as we speak now, I think there was a very shameful incident in South Africa where our team was stranded because the government could not pay for the accommodation, and so many other shameful occurrences. We are not prepared for any progress. And even as we move forward, we have a very small group of guys who pretend to be stable, a very, very thin middle class that is keeping, this impression of progress. Kenya is not making any progress. That is why the debt keeps on rising.
Accumulating.
Yeah, and it's the same for so many African countries. So from the 1800s, when there was a scramble for Africa, it's again happening now, and we are not ready for it.
Yet.
Yes.
Okay, very true. Now, in terms of the trade between the two, Russia and Africa as well, just looking at the numbers, Russia dominates arms sales in Africa. They're also looking into joint projects which are underway, industries, agriculture, healthcare, education, and the likes. But with the over-dependence that is currently witnessed on China, what does it spell on the continent, giving in mind that, yes, we might need some support from these countries who are willing, but it comes with a price? Where does Africa stand?
When it comes to economic negotiations, when you have what we call lack of a base, an economic base, you're always disadvantaged. And just like you said, every single gift that comes from a place like China or Russia, it comes with strings attached. Like now, the Chinese came with a lot of gifts, and we were excited. But of course, at the end of the day, those were debts. That is what has helped in ballooning our debt. And in the long term, our kids and our kids' kids will be burdened with debt. Our leaders, of course, don't care. And so we stand as weak beginners in all this. And what we need internal measures to make sure our leaders are kept in check as far as accepting gifts that come with strings attached are concerned. And borrowing has to actually be resisted. And, economic development goes hand in hand with the openness of a democracy. Like in Kenya today, we don't have an opposition. We actually have a group of guys who agree very quickly on everything. When it comes to borrowing, Eurobond, SDR, and all that, they just say, okay, let's go. So we don't have an opposition. So in places where there's no democracy, borrowing is very high, there are no checks and balances, and the economies are crashing. So it's a very unfortunate case. And you remember sometimes back the Chinese wanted to take over the port because of our, an inability to service alone. Yeah. So it will get to a point where they'll actually come in and say, because you cannot do this, we have to take this and get back our money. So we have to be very, very careful. And we have what we call misguided investment in capital projects. You just wake up from nowhere and say, we're going to do it, to have an SDR from some place to place. When you look at it in the long run, you don't see returns on investment.
Economic visibility, yes.
So we have so many countries that have gotten so much funding for useless projects. For example, when you look at the SDR that was, Madaraka Express and all that, the returns do not make the project visible. It shouldn't have happened. There are so many places where the money could have been invested to boost the economy in a very, very serious way. But, we already have it, so we cannot undo it.
Yeah,
if you look at what Kibaki did with the Thika Superhighway, the economy picked up so quickly because the project was economically viable. Yeah, so we don't have that kind of vision when it comes to current investment.
All right, speaking on vision, I think it's, coincidence that you also brought it up. Those talk of the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to Westlands Expressway that is, sort of supposed to pass through a section of Uhuru Park. We well know some urban cities are, well associated with the parks. New York has Central Park, looking at London. I hear of Hyde Park. I've never been there, of course. But in terms of Kenya now, we well know of the fight behind ensuring that that particular space of land is, within the public domain. Now, if we're set to plan a construction of about 27 kilometers, the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to Westlands Expressway, passing through Uhuru Park, what does this speak to the environmental, fighters in Kenya and actually the plan of the government? What do you make of it?
Well, I think the idea itself of, creating an expressway from the airport to Westlands is okay. But you see now the process itself has not been open enough to involve what we call public participation, because I think Kenyans have various views on the passage. And when it comes to Uhuru Park, that is a place that shouldn't be touched. From way back during the days of Wangari Maathai, there was a fight over Uhuru Park.
Yes.
It should not be touched. There are so many ways that can be, explored to have that expressway. And Kibaki, and during the Kibaki-Raila, government, they had to think and come up with the bypass, southern bypass and all that, eastern and all that. So they allowed for the movement of lorries, especially from Mombasa to Westlands, without necessarily going through the CBD.
Yes.
So we don't have to have the sanctity of Uhuru Park violated for us to have an expressway. So the engineers have to be, consulted, and we have to come up with a way of avoiding the violation of the historical Uhuru Park. And if the president goes ahead and does that, I think it won't work well. Kibaki did not do it because he respected Uhuru Park. I've heard so many guys even talking about the uselessness of the Nairobi National Park. They're arguing that we don't get as much from the park as we could if we just went ahead and used it for other purposes. That we're getting, that is a mark of our heritage as a nation. So you can't just do that.
Very true. Now, but still, let's look at it the other way. Have there been any environmental, social, and economic impact assessments done by the government before, pushing for plans to start in terms of building this expressway? I think that's one area we really need to look at, right?
Yeah, we have a problem when it comes to studies. In Kenya, we don't do that. And when we commission a study on anything, most of the time it's doctored. That is why you find so many companies in the industrial area, not being checked when it comes to release of waste to sewer lines and all that. We don't carry out the environmental impact assessment studies at any one point. So that is why actually they went ahead and had the bypass into the national park without even telling Kenyans, even as we do this, the impact won't be as much. But you realize the animals have to be pushed to some other place.
Yeah.
So we don't have that said. I think it's not been, if it's been done, it's not been shared. So as far as I know, it's not been done.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, serious questions rising from that, but we'll definitely keep the conversation ongoing. We'll spare time for the, Botswana elections and the protests happening in Ethiopia as well. But that's basically it for today's edition of Africa Week in Review. Thank you so much for your contribution, as always. Oyieyo, right there.